Okay, welcome to another episode of From A to B. I'm Shiva, I'm a senior strategist at Spiro, and I'm super excited to be talking to Kenya, who is a PM at Microsoft, right?
Yep.
So why don't you go ahead and tell me a little bit about yourself and your
Yeah.
journey specifically to experimentation. Sorry to interrupt. Your journey to experimentation, because you've now transitioned a little bit into a PM role. So I think you're a very interesting person to talk about specifically. I think sometimes it's like the opposite. People transition from PM to experimentation because they're like, PM, that's stupid. I want to do fun stuff like experiments. But you did it the wrong way. So let's hear why you're doing it the wrong way.
I did do it the wrong way. So I started at one company, and I was managing their content authoring team that included like design, UAT, operations, all of that stuff. And then I quickly moved into the experimentation role. So I built out their team there. And from there, I moved on to Evolytics, which is a analytics consulting firm where I was the associate director of experimentation. And so I was able to see multiple companies and how their programs were running at that time. So there's a lot of different ways everyone is doing it with interesting combos of platforms. And now I've moved into the PM space at Microsoft, and it is very, very rewarding, but a very interesting perspective as I keep that layer of experimentation everywhere I go. And I see how it permeates with different teams and where it doesn't. So definitely an interesting pathway.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I've been consulting with some clients where like you said, some do interesting teams and orgs of experimentation. One of the clients I've been working with they have like an experimentation program that's kind of just disseminated through the PMs. So they don't have a dedicated person for experimentation. They have a PM where one of their 5 jobs is experimentation.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's a little bit of how you're kind of doing things. You're a PM and that's kind of one of your jobs. But you come from that background of experimentation, which ultimately yields you a net benefit because you understand it, versus a lot of times it's like you're a PM and you're like, I got to do all this work. And it's like, oh, by the way, run experiments too. And they're like, okay, I don't know what you want me to do. I don't know how to do this. So like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. I would definitely say, coming from the career path that I did, my perspective is different because something as simple as the question of what's the business value of this feature, of this change, my first thought is, all right, what was the impact of your experiments? What was the results of your analyses? Like where did you land on that? And that makes it so much easier to quantify the value of the feature. What I'm starting to see with those that I work with who don't have that background or are kind of repelling the experimentation push, they're struggling a bit with that question, which is directly correlated to prioritization. So how do you even get your things in that you think are super important, whether you think they're important or not? Everybody else doesn't know how to quantify that. So they're kind of relying on you. And so I see them struggling with that. Whereas I'm just like, all right, cool. I know how to go get that answer and not stay up all night and make like brainstorm web things, like trying to figure it out.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's almost like going from experimentation to PM is a nice way to Trojan horse prioritization of experiments within project management, which is ultimately a good thing. You want to make sure that organizations are evangelizing experimentation in any way. But That's kind of interesting. Is that why you've done it that way?
For me, it was more of curiosity. I wanted to see what was going on the other side, the other side of experimentation. Experimentation is always exciting, a lot going on, you have to be really on your toes all the time, whether it be you're diving into some data science practices or you're trying to understand marketing and why they're doing half of the stuff they're doing. And this role, it's very, very narrow focus of, I need to make this feature successful. I need to make this transition successful by any means necessary. And so there's less of that lens of well, how do I implement the best version of itself? That's the view that many don't have. So that's where I feel like I have an edge on others in this role.
Yeah, for sure. And you're just using experimentation as part of your toolkit to
Yeah.
provide the best possible features. Awesome. So let's take a couple steps back and talk a little bit about your experience building experimentation programs. One of the things that I've been like mulling about is, and I talked to Craig Sullivan in the last episode, is there's a little bit of like, not the weirdest analogy, but like it just makes sense. You almost have to be Donkey from Shrek in the way that you're kind of annoying, but you have that enthusiasm. You
Yes.
kind of bluntly get shit done. And like Shrek didn't want Donkey, but Shrek got Donkey and it worked.
Yeah.
So there's
It's
a little bit
definitely a
about
love-hate relationship. Everybody is like, I really want to like you, but you really irritate me.
yeah. Yeah, especially when sometimes experimentation is seen as the enemy of proving your baby wrong rather than no. Donkey helped made Shrek better.
Yep.
I'm gonna
Yep.
stick with the Shrek example. But specifically with that, I think it's a dissemination of like what are the personality traits that make an experimentation person good, or I guess let's flip that around and say what are traits that makes an experimentation person not good? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, the opposite, not good. So I like to think of experimenters in two buckets. I know everything exists on the spectrum, but we're gonna, for simplicity, two buckets.
Yeah.
You have your scientific, mathematical side of the brain of the experimenter, and then you have the strategist, the very fluid, can pull in multiple things that are happening and make things theoretically make sense. Those are two very different, strong skill sets. One doesn't have to be strong in both. But both need to exist in your program. What does not make a good experimenter is someone who's not willing to ask why the numbers look the way they do. So when I was in college, there was always a battle between the physicists and the engineers. And all 7 of us physicists would be us against the 200 engineers in the class. And it would get really heated sometimes. And the reason is because engineers, and there's no shade to engineers, but they were really focused on the how to do it. Like, oh, this is, you put this plug here, that plug there, and things flow through it. And from a physicist perspective, we were always like, but why? Where did it come from? What happens at the end? Like, there's so many other things or factors to include in your equation per se, like if you think of it that way. So their equation would be this long and ours would be half a page by the time we're done. And I think that that's what makes a better experimenter, is that you not only know how to do it, that's one thing. You can get a whole lot of people who know how to execute an experiment, how to plug in the numbers and get an answer. But someone who could take it a step further and tell that story and really understand the next steps, like, all right, whether this won or loss in your eyes, knowing that next step is a lot more difficult than just like looking at what number came out. Oh, cool, this is higher, so let's move to the next one. Yeah, but if we dissect it a bit, it's situationally higher. So maybe we've got some seasonality or some things to look at. So I think that person, that's probably the biggest trait that causes someone to fail.
I really like that because it's, I'm thinking specifically about hiring, for example, like a developer on an experimentation team, and simply having a person that can take a mock-up, take a Figma file, whatever, build out this test and move on works. Like, that's fine. But that doesn't help you be proactive in, for example, an engineer that could look at a mock-up and then look at the way the website is designed and then understand what you're testing, why you're testing. That developer can be more proactive and be like, I understand, I've disseminated it down. By the way, based on my technical knowledge, you should also do this, or maybe we could try this. And like having that forefront to think about the experimentation side, and not only think about, but be curious about it, because I think it's like ultimately that's down to the curiosity aspect or like the learning aspect. Like you're just, is it just being data driven? Like, is that just the ultimate like personality trait of an experimentation person?
Well, oh gosh, everyone hate me for this. I feel like that's a trigger word. So we talked
Okay.
about going through some trigger things today. And I think that everyone wants to be data driven. They throw it around like, I'm data driven, like I'm open. It's like the
Yeah.
person says, yeah, I'm an open book, but their book comes with like a few locks. And once you unlock them, then it's open. And so data driven, now that's definitely on a spectrum of, do you like to know and understand the data? Do you know how to get the data? Do you know where it comes from? And like
Yeah.
being data driven from my perspective means that you in and out understand that data, where it comes from, why it's captured the way it is, and you know its strengths and weaknesses. So I'm getting this variable, I'm getting this number, but I know that it falls weak once it passes a certain point in the customer cycle. So I might have some integrity issues. So it's not just like, oh, I love seeing lots of numbers and colors and visualizations. I get a lot of those. And I'm like, cool. Why
Yeah.
do you need this metric? They can't tell me. They just threw it on there because they thought it makes sense. But as you know, with our careers and our jobs, like it was about telling the story. So knowing what data mattered and what didn't. So yes, the person in all, yes, data driven, but what type
Yeah.
of data driven person are they?
Well, it's not like cherry picking data either, right? Like I'm data driven
Right.
about the data that makes me look good.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I also think like, so I was talking to Craig about this a little bit too. And I think there's a little bit of like being humble, like take, we were talking about this. It's like take the idea of right or wrong out of the equation in the sense of you don't know. That's why you run experiments.
Yep.
So your guess rate is probably like terrible at win or lose. You can use research to get you to be more educated about it, but the reason you run experiments is because you don't know. So like don't be confident in your ability to guess versus not. Recognize that you have a tool that absolves you of that accountability of being right or wrong.
Yep.
And he was saying like it's almost liberating where you just like I don't have to be right because this tool is just going to let me know where to go.
Oh, and I think honestly, I think that's the biggest downfall of most programs. When they put a number on it, we want the experimentation team to generate X million dollars this year. I mean, what does that mean? Like X million and saving you from making a really bad decision, or X million as in like I saved your team from executing that and that times X amount of days and people. Like there's, to your point, it's like we are here to be agnostic of the platform of whatever it is. We're here just to research and give you some direction, not even an answer. Like it's just here is a direction that seems to be working or not working. And you could even go a step further, as we like to, and test that theory and make sure that that's true and not just a situational win or that, you know, that false positive that we talk about. So
Yeah.
yeah.
On that note, like when you're, so we just talked a little bit about skills for like hiring for an experimentation person, but like have specifically about hiring experimentation folks, have you noticed things of like when you're talking to someone and you're interviewing them for a, you know, a position on your team, what are some green flags or potentially red flags for hiring within experimentation? And it doesn't even have to be trait based, but like what are things you've noticed that like, oh yeah, this guy or girl, this person's going to be awesome at experimentation, or they say something and you're like,
Yep. I get, yeah. So I have learned, just for context, I went through 19 interviews before I found the first hired experimenter on my first team. And the reason was for that was that there was a lot of green flags in people and then red flags. What I realized there wasn't with experimenters, I think you've heard this before, we're almost like unicorns, very hard to find. It is, we're hard to find good ones. That
and
can
sometimes the unicorn is just like a person with like a cone on their head. it's a fake unicorn. They're not actually
Yeah,
a
they're
unicorn.
just like, I think I can do this. I read enough stuff. It's like,
Yeah,
okay.
totally.
But like the green flags, I'll start with the good stuff first. The green flags are always, or some of my favorite questions are, run me through the last, maybe not even the last, but one of your favorite experiments and the results. That alone can be a very open, extended question, or for someone, it can be very straightforward and concise. They're like, yeah, I take this template, I plug in this number, and it spits out these things. I'm like, all right, cool. I now know that you are capable of following directions or following a guide. All right. And then my next question is usually, so for those calculations, do you tweak those according to the test? If they're like, oh, well, they're already there, that kind of gives me an idea that you don't really understand the calculations that go behind it and maybe how they relate to each other. That explains human behavior.
Totally.
So it's like, all right, you may have been like a execution level tester. And so green flags is usually if they can explain some of those calculations and why those numbers are what they are. You can't tell me that you were, if someone's like, yeah, I was 100% confident. I'm like, no, you don't even know that you can't have that. Like, that's not a real thing. Which kind of trickles into red flags. Red flags are that you get a lot of those, how do they describe the words? Not trigger words, but like the flashy words that are used within Crow
Buzzwords.
Yeah, buzzwords of like, yeah, p-value and confidence. And I'm like, yeah, but like pull them together and explain to me what was happening with this test. Those are always like red flags if they can't explain the story end to end or how they got there. And then I think the other red flag, which is hard to capture in an interview, is about roadmaps. So
Yeah.
it is important as an experimenter to be curious about the future, but also attempt to predict the future. That is your job. That's what they want you to do. If you can't give me like ideas that make sense together, everyone can just throw out ideas. And I think they think everyone's an experimenter at heart. You want to participate in the process, but you may not be an experimenter. So that's usually some red flags. So in there, yeah, there's green and red flags somewhere in there. It just depends on what I need at the time.
Yeah. I mean, even like you mentioned, sometimes people are just looking at macro level metrics. Like you mentioned, they're not looking at the behaviors. They can't talk about the story. But I think part of it is they can't talk about it because, like we talked about before, they don't have that passion or interest to want to know why it happened. As a result, they're not thinking forward. They're not thinking in the future. They're looking at like, I want this test to win. Did it win? Yes, no. Okay, we'll try something else. It's not like we talk about this a lot, test to learn, not test to win. Is it a holistic strategy of an iterative approach to gaining insights and testing into influencing that behavior in a positive way? If they're just looking at like, I ran this test and it lifted conversion rate by 10%. Oh, cool. How? The tool told me so.
Right.
No. And that's a lack of curiosity into like why, because that why is where you get that green of not just the 10%, 70%, 80%. You hit those huge wins, sometimes losses, sure, but like that's where the green is. And that's where the interesting part of this experimentation is that curiosity. You want to be part of a team where you're just sharing this passion, like we talk about Donkey. You don't want to deal with Shrek in your experimentation program.
Genuinely, like I think a real experimenter is consistent in their curiosity. And that's why people love and hate us, is because the level of energy we bring is sometimes too much for the room. It's like, man, this test, according to you guys, lost, but it won in all these different ways, and they've already checked out. They're like, what? It didn't win. It's like, yeah, but you learned this and this and this. And if you can't quantify or relate that to what matters to them, that's where it starts to fall short. But we have also learned that we have to get creative and find ways to tie that back into why they might care about it. So definitely a job that will teach you some serious communication skills.
Well, that's a great like segue into something else I want to talk to you about, which is like just generally politics, right? So again, like keep on going back to the Shrek example. To be a donkey in this example of Shrek versus donkey. You have to kind of be annoying, but you get results. You're pestering, but you're doing it for the right reasons. You're not doing it because you're being selfish. You want to like steal the resourcing. You're doing it because you want to build an experimentation program that drives business growth, that generates insights, and that makes the business money. That's your goal. And you're not competing with the interest of other folks. It's different prioritization for sure, but sometimes you have to play that politics role. Are there any particular examples, right? Just in general, like tips for like navigating the murky waters within the swamp of experimentation? What are some like tips or tricks that you maybe have for navigating these murky waters of politics and dealing with maybe people who don't trust experimentation or see you as an enemy, or just don't get it, like they don't get p-values, and it just slows us down. We want to do what we want to do. Specifically, your experience from that PM, like now you're in that PM role and you understand the value of experimentation, but now you have to speak to it to PM. So what do you think?
I think that so for them, it's always so hard for me because I want them to want to do it, but it's to your point, a lot of times it's the convincing of the value of it. And so what I found to work in the politics space with experimentation, driving the value, helping people to understand where to insert it in their job. I usually try to understand what the overall organization, or if it's company wide, depending on the pocket that you're sitting in with experimentation, I like to observe what the overall goal is of the experimentation program. Are we testing and learning, or are we just trying to drive conversion? Which both can exist, but if you don't understand the ratio of that, it's going to make your job significantly harder. So I know we've talked about road mapping and all of that. Whenever you're creating that roadmap and that tree of options and pathways, marking them as this is a nice have in understanding your customer, whereas this test might give you a clear indication as to what strategy to start with or go with. You might be doing like a multi-arm bandit for that because you're just saying, I need to push some things out and get an idea. Whereas you might do an A/B test for completely different color palettes, which is everyone's favorite, or maybe you're actually testing like a propensity model that's predicting what the behaviors of some of your customers that you are unsure about. That can go any direction. So a lot of times, if you can understand what that ratio is, it gives you an idea of what percent of effort to put into each lane. So that when you're in those conversations with those organizations or those teams that are on the fence or don't really want to participate, they're low on resources, they don't have devs who know how to execute it, they don't have access to the platform, there's like an uphill battle for them. Picking maybe the route that would give them some returns might be the best way to kind of insert yourself, get them warmed up to it, and then expose some of the other stuff. I think people will get excited and will say, there's all these different types of tests that you can do. There's all these things that you can learn. They're like, cool, which one makes me the most money? And as painful as that is to hear, it is why they are experimenting. So you have to understand why that particular team might be one experiment. And I think in time, I've watched so many get so excited after seeing the results and understanding what that story gave them, even if they were hoping for a win and you're like, according to your criteria of a win and loss, it lost. But in terms of all these other things that you're curious about within your space, you gained all this knowledge. It's going back to your example, it is Donkey and Shrek. I was thinking of like dating. I'm like, that is like you're courting that person to say like,
Totally.
You're trying to get them to trust you. It's all about trust because they're spending time for running it, time to set it up, time to analyze it, time to implement it. Experimentation shouldn't be taken lightly, especially if you don't have the means from a system perspective to just shoot them out and get results quickly. A lot of people are dealing with very small numbers, so they have to be very purposeful in what they're testing. So I have sympathy there.
Let me play devil's advocate though. So let's say you are talking about, and to be fair, like with the I don't think there's a right or wrong answer with this. It is a balance of understanding the business, understanding where you're at. And is it like, are you trying to build the experimentation program and build these relationships and build the trust, or are you trying to drive results? Unfortunately, sometimes they don't intersect. In a perfect world, they do, but sometimes they don't, and it does suck. But what about the devil's advocate thought that I have about training people into wrong and bad behaviors that they like? You run a test because of political reasons, and then they see the test, and then they're like, all right, well, let's keep on doing that because you ran it this way. And then it's like, no, instead you have to balance the relationship, balance doing it, but also realize that there's certain tests that you have to run for your program to be successful. You have to run these learning tests. And not every test is going to be conversion rate winner. Not every test you run should be, because you're not optimizing towards conversion rate. It's almost you're optimizing for an insight generation. But just thinking about, like, obviously you have to play the politics to gain trust and build a program and educate. But you also have to build a program and run it the right way. Yeah.
Yep.
What do you think?
That's where every experimenter has to pull out their little devil horns. If you are the manager, I have like a very clear example that's in my head. I will not put any details to it, but let's just say that been in that exact situation, and it went as far up to as like the VP and them saying, you have to push this. And I think in those cases, if you're, I hate to say this, but it's more of like, if you're the manager, you have a little bit more leeway into what I'm about to say versus just the analyst. Might be a little hard, but
Totally.
From a manager perspective, you're running the program. You have your word, your integrity, your data is everything. That is what makes you trustworthy. If you run an experiment that goes against everything that your program stands for and what you typically do or what you're pushing to do, I like to put disclaimers. I like to attach them and permeate it all throughout the test. The setup usually has notes somewhere. The report, during speaking on the report, any communications of the test. And if I have enough traffic, and I've done this a few times, I've run the test in tandem and basically isolating out the group. So I'll just create 2 streams and separate, the visitor count. It might take twice as long, but at least I can do a true comparison. It's the same environment. What doesn't work is if you do one after the other, different time frames, different periods, it just doesn't work. So if you run them together, that's where you have to use that for your argument for the future to say, and you might even be wrong. Let's put that's a devil's advocate. You're like, oh,
Totally.
I thought I was going to be right. But in the case that you were right in what your practice was and how that generated completely different results based on whatever the test was, take that info and then I would make sure that gets back to that leader or set up that time to say, hey, can we talk about what this program is supposed to be doing? If there's anything that needs to be on a fast track, there's literally practices within data science and within all of the different tools that we use to experiment with that people could use to do a fast track if that's what they want to do. But don't throw it into the A/B test and learn space and try to force something to happen.
Yeah. I mean, there's even tests like, for example, one of the examples I had, and we're pretty early on in my career, is I was an analyst. So I was tasked with running. I wasn't a manager. There was no, C-suite level of kind of buy-in or help me politic. It was just me as the lowly analyst trying to run an experimentation program and building it relatively successfully, albeit limited, obviously, without that leadership. But one of the tests I was tasked to run, I straight up told them very early on in the process, I said, look, this test is not going to reach statistical significance ever, within years. So this is not a worthwhile test for us to do. Still wanted to go ahead with it. And that's where like you said, those disclaimers is such a fantastic opportunity for you to unfortunately, in a really not the best ways, you show them the receipts to be like, I told you so.
I told you that I did not agree with this. But that's important for your job. and for
The
your
integrity
integrity,
too,
as
yeah,
you move forward,
100%.
people know, like, is this backed? And that can become part of your program. Is it backed by the experimentation program? No. Okay. And you're persisting. Cool. And I think what people in the politics space, what they want to be able to do is go and run and tell mom and dad that everybody else in the class isn't doing what they want. Mom and dad comes in, do it. And everyone's like, all right, fine.
Yeah,
They want to be able to do that, but they don't want the consequences that come with if they're wrong.
totally.
And so if you're gonna, hold, like, put my arm behind my back and make me do this, all right, well then I'll make sure that it's not to be like some bad blood or anything like that. Like, there's even a healthy way of doing that. It's like, all right, cool.
Accountability,
Gonna put a
right?
disclaimer that this is how we feel, like in the sizing, this is what was observed. And halfway through, when we check in on it, if it is trending in the way that we predicted, what would you like to do? If they're like, all right, if it is, then pull the plug. And that's how you also keep the politics part from completely obliterating your program, because you don't want a political war. And in the end, they're still wrong, but they win because you couldn't hold your, like, hold it
Yeah.
together.
I mean, in a way, it's just accountability. But I think sometimes those tests are actually not the worst thing in the world, because what it does is you have to eat, not you as in the person who will break the prioritization framework or for something that you've made it very clear is not worthwhile doing. And then it becomes clear it wasn't worthwhile doing, but you said it up front. It actually can build trust. There's like,
Yep.
oh, I guess they're not an idiot. I guess they know what they're
And a
talking
lot
about.
of times it's why you're challenged. They're like, oh, I did it at this other place. And I'm like, that other place had different customers, different everything, different website. Was it the same website? And it's like, if it was not, they're like, oh, this other experimentation program I work for is so robust. I'm like, did you run the experiment? No. Did you analyze it? No. You just picked up the receipts? Okay. And you don't even know how to understand. So it's
Yeah.
comical. Like, I think that we also can't sweat the big stuff or the little stuff. We can't afford to get really worked up about anything, really. We have to be able to move on. We have to be capable of being wrong, embarrassed, everything. Take accountability immediately. We've all been in a situation where we've reported on numbers and look back and be like, oh no, that's not what I wanted to report on. And so we truly are the epitome of open and flexible and able to adapt quickly.
Yep. Cool. Well, awesome. I mean, we're basically a little over time, but Kenny, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your thoughts and insights. This was awesome. Do you have anything you want to plug? Anything you want to talk about here?
First, thanks for having me. And I would like to plug in, if you are a data analyst, in experimentation in the analytics space, I would definitely encourage checking out the Digital Analytics Association. So I sit on the board for DAA, and all we do is serve the community and try to give back on courses, webinars, sessions, certification skill sets. So I think that is an area that is experimentation is an area that needs to grow amongst our space, our community, and everyone is always running and trying to understand what's the best way to do XYZ. So DAA is a really good outlet for that. Definitely encourage people to become a part of it.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Kenny. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.